Denver developer group leaders, and this is also my second year on the planning committee for Mile High Dreamin. It's truly awesome and exciting to see how many people are here this year, and I'm really grateful that we could all be here in person today. So thanks again for being here and for showing up for the second day. So, kicking off the day, I have the great pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Peter Coffey. Peter is the Vice President of Strategic Research at Salesforce and has been at Salesforce for almost 17 years. He's a true visionary, working with IT managers, software developers, and policymakers across the globe, striving to understand their needs and promoting the immense potential of AI and cloud computing. Peter's depth of knowledge, unique perspective, and thought leadership have consistently brought invaluable insights to our community, and his willingness to share his findings and insights with us, often fresh and groundbreaking content, which is awesome because for our specific Denver community and for the Mile High Dreamin events, he typically shares fresh content, and this content has been invaluable to our community. So we're immensely grateful to have Peter for his contributions and for him being here today to do his keynote speech, for helping us navigate the rapidly evolving landscape of AI and cloud computing, and preparing us for what lies ahead. So, without further ado, let's extend a warm welcome to Peter Coffey.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be back. Because of the timing of this event, it's typically the last time I get to talk to a group who are very much of Salesforce, but not employed by Salesforce. This is the first, outside audience that's deeply invested in us that I'll be talking to before Dreamforce. Dreamforce this year is going to be amazing. It's going to have enormous amounts of stuff that we could not show a year ago. In fact, that pretty much no one was showing last year. And I'm not going to be doing a Dreamforce preview today. You'll have plenty of opportunity to see that. What I get to do with a group like this is not give you the world according to Salesforce. There are plenty of places where you can find that. But to kind of talk about the world of our community as individual professionals, as often change agents in our corporations or other organizations, and kind of provide a context in which the other things that we'll be seeing at events like Dreamforce and as other technical offerings come forward, we can kind of fit that into a picture that makes sense. And 2 weeks ago, I really did not know what the main axis of this talk was going to be, but there was one of those things on the radio that kind of gets to when they were talking about gasoline prices. And they were talking about people demanding that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve be opened to get the price of gasoline back down to $4 a gallon or whatever, which is kind of crazy. It's cheaper than bottled water, which is nuts in the first place. And somehow they managed to function in countries like Spain with gasoline prices that are closer to $6 a gallon. They sell it by the liter, but that's the equivalent. And every time that they do that, it kind of bugs me because the purpose of prices is to send the signals. And if you deliberately distort the signals, then you're putting on distorting lenses. You're holding up a funhouse mirror to the world and not letting it show you what's true. And that really got me thinking about, well, what are the things that are changing in our world? Now, when you hear the word price, a lot of people will think about this famous Oscar Wilde quote. I'm sure you've all heard this one before. A cynic is someone who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. And when people say this, I think they mean it to sound kind of contemptuous of, oh, well, let's not talk about prices. Prices don't matter. Well, it turns out there is a second part to the fragment of the conversation that this quote from Oscar Wilde's play comes from, where someone replies, yes, well, a sentimentalist is someone who sees absurd value in everything and doesn't know the market price of anything. And I think that that's a helpful perspective because we rely on prices. They matter. They matter particularly because, and some of you have seen me make reference to this George Gilder comment before, economic eras are demarcated by things that were abundant becoming scarce or things that were scarce becoming abundant. Industrial Revolution in England. Power suddenly became abundant but you have to go to the city to use it because of the massive, economies of scale of building very large steam engines and factories. And this happened at the same time that land, which had been abundant, became scarce. So you got this mass migration from the farms to the cities and from individual agricultural practitioners to factory workers. That was the actual revolution. And it was because of a combination of abundance and scarcity signaled by prices. And if you hear people say, how come every time the price of oil goes up, the oil companies suddenly report that they've got more reserves? What have they been hiding from us? These are people who don't literally understand the meaning of the word reserves as it's used in natural resources, which is we know where it is and we could extract it at a price that's worth the cost. If the price goes up, by definition, reserves get bigger because now there's stuff you can get that you couldn't get before. That's not necessarily a good thing. We want oil and coal to stay in the ground as long as possible. We don't want them being burned. Having the price go up, which means that more can be extracted, that's not a good thing. What it does mean, though, is that the idea that we will ever run out is probably wrong, because when the price goes up, things happen. You substitute man-made capital for natural resources. You substitute solar and wind power for burning oil. You are able to just do things that are different, probably better, but you have to have belief in the price system for this to function. And another interesting point that someone made is that if you don't have prices, you wind up doing really stupid things. The number of different ways that you can combine resources is colossal, and almost all of the ways that you can combine things are useless. The example that was offered is you don't hand the Terminator robot a scalpel and say, now you can do brain surgery. It doesn't really work that way. Combinations have to make sense. Prices have to signal intelligent behavior, because only a tiny fraction of all the possible ways to combine resources is useful at all. Now, when prices change, we pay attention. Some of you have seen me use this example before about the computer conference in 1955. We talked about, oh, well, you're never really going to build programs that do one specific thing, because writing a program is a really expensive thing to do. You'll write accounting programs that everybody uses, but you'll never write, purpose-built code. Yes, you will. Back then, they were talking about machine time worth hundreds of dollars an hour, and coder time worth $3 to $6 an hour. These numbers have easily changed, both of them, in opposite directions by maybe factors of several hundred. And that changes our jobs. It changes our jobs from being people who write operating systems or general ledger accounting systems or other baseware and middleware into much more vertically focused and activity-oriented applications that create experiences for human beings instead of automating the functions of businesses or schools or hospitals. And that's a really important shift that really in many organizations is still ongoing. Shifting from, this is what we do, let's computerize it, because that's really not a verb that means anything anymore. Let's automate our current activities. Let's automate the side effect of what we do and call that our database. No, we're flipping the script, saying, what are the things that people want to do and how do we facilitate those? How do we give them better access to information, to prediction, to optimization, where before we had to settle for the first answer we could get was going to have to be good enough. Now we can generate tons of possible answers and see with slider variables what's going to give us the combinations we want. There's much more power to make decisions now, much more necessity to make decisions. You've heard the phrase paradox of choice, where people are overwhelmed by the flexibility they're being given. And that's one of the things that the methods derived from AI research can help us do, is help people focus instead of being overwhelmed. Well, those are hundredfold changes. What happens when the prices change by factors of 100 to billion or more, which is what's happened to the cost of computation over the last few decades? You've probably seen me use this example before. 100 billion-fold reduction in the amount of energy required to drive a computing transaction we simply do a lot more of these things than we ever did before, but we also do them in different ways and for different reasons. And that is why the title of the talk today, for those of you who are wondering, is this a James Bond movie where we're going to have 20 minutes of pre-title sequence here, is Repricing Everything. Because the cool thing about getting to talk to a group like this is I don't need to explain why Salesforce. I don't need to give you the world according to us. Instead, we can look at the world of us, the world in which we are all trying to make our contributions as individuals, maybe as heads of families or as advisors to family members, and also as leaders of our organizations. If you've ever taken any kind of economics class, you've seen supply and demand curves. And the person who invented this formalism in 1890 said something very interesting. Even as he was proposing this way of looking at, supply, the more you're willing to pay, the harder people will work to make it, but the price, is going to go up as that quantity goes up on the supply side. But at the same time, the more you charge, the less people will buy. So there's a crossing of curves. And at that crossing point, maybe you get a market equilibrium. But what Alfred Marshall said is, we're only guessing how much of anything people would buy if the price is very different from what they're accustomed to pay for. Now, in the last few years, we've been able to start taking these things from broad crayon strokes down to, in fact, sharp pencil curves. And we've got mechanisms like Uber surge pricing, where you can actually measure what is the effect of a surge price. Do people wait 10 minutes and then come back and check later, or do they decide to walk or take the subway train in the city? We can actually start getting data feeds now that take some of these kind of hand-wavy ideas and maybe start to make them useful for decision-making and optimization once we realize we can do that. Now, it's controversial if you're logging in on Amazon and you see a different price than your friend saw for the exact same object a little while before, maybe 5 minutes earlier. The notion that suppliers are always testing us and maybe charging different prices to different people based on their willingness to pay more. Someone demonstrated once that if you call up an Uber from the Four Seasons Hotel to the airport, you are quoted a much higher fare than calling up an Uber from the 7-Eleven store across the street from the Four Seasons Hotel. It uses your origin address to estimate your willingness to pay, or so it appears. And people are not always happy about that. The person who invented price tags, because they weren't always there. You'd go into the store and ask the clerk, for your order, and they would bring up the price for you. The person who invented price tags actually saw them as an almost religious act of making all people equal in the eyes of merchants in the same way that they were, and this was his own phrase, equal in the eyes of God. It was a moral act to put a price tag on something and charge the same price to everybody, as opposed to kind of eyeing their clothing and maybe whether they walked in the door with a servant in tow and estimating the price they'd be willing to pay. This is a very interesting idea today. We sort of think of, walk in the door and there's the price. The idea that everything used to be up for haggling is novel. When we don't like the price that we're being given, bad things can happen. And I've already talked about what happens when people get irritated about the price of gasoline and demand that the government subsidize it, thereby destroying the value of the price as a signaling mechanism. Well, these last few years, the demands that governments and other entities adjust prices to allow people to function in a world of pandemic and climate change, these have been right. And the OECD has talked about the number and the size of various subsidies. We're having a very controversial moment right now, where people who were allowed to go for quite some time without making payments on various costs. We've had eviction moratoria in the apartment buildings in some major cities. You're saying, no, you can't do any evictions because of the pandemic. And now that's coming back. There have been people being allowed to go for months without paying rent, and now they're being told, yeah, well, eventually you have to do that. Student loan payments are on the table right now. There are people who've been given some time without needing to make those payments, and now that maybe that's coming back. And they're not happy about it. The degree to which these things mess us up is substantial. They tilt the playing field. They change the signals. we wind up doing the wrong thing for longer because we have a mistaken idea of how cheap it is. And we don't move vigorously enough to embrace new innovations. Then there's the other problem of prices where we pretend the price doesn't even exist. This is sometimes called by economists an externality, an unpriced externality, when people who are putting pollution into the world don't have to pay for it. If you introduce some kind of system in which there are fees for carbon discharge or carbon tax or whatever, there will be people who jump up and down and say, you're giving people a license to pollute. Well, yeah, except that right now they're doing it without a license. They're doing it without paying anything, which I think is clearly worse. When you put a price on these things, people can be a little surprised to realize what they've been paying. They just haven't been writing a check for it or swiping their credit card for it. The price of putting junk into our air is estimated at costing the average human being on the planet about 2 years of their life. Okay, good to know. And if you look at the life expectancy impact of particulates in the air, that turns out to be only worse. But then there's other things like drinking alcohol or road injuries or other things. Wow, price is a multi-attribute thing. It's not just money. It's years of life, quality of life, peace of mind, whatever. There are countries in which instead of running by GDP, a dollar-denominated gross domestic product, they actually try to compute a sort of wellness index and optimize policy based on that, which is an interesting idea. Hard to quantify, hard to get people to agree on it, and because price matter in so many different parts of our lives, the rest of what follows is going to be basically a three-act plan. Act one, let's just talk about the world in which we live. Food, shelter, health, and education. Let's talk for most of the remaining time we'll have. Most of the time we'll spend with you today is going to be what you probably thought a Mile High Dreamin keynote would mainly be about, talent, technology, and process. But at the end, let's also zoom out and have a little bit of a section that I call Earth, Wind, and Fire. So let's begin. Imagine if you are my age or maybe slightly younger, the song Stayin' Alive playing right now, because that's what this act is about, food, shelter, health, and education, and the Bee Gees singing Stayin' Alive. We got out of the habit, maybe 20 years, of talking about inflation. It just wasn't a thing. It was a big deal during prior presidential administrations in the Carter and Reagan presidential campaign. Inflation was a big deal. The combination of inflation rate and other numbers was called the misery index, and it was a big factor in people's planning. And then for a while, prices just kind of seemed to be just kind of leveling off. And the discussion on Google Trends of inflation just kind of went on. People talked about it now and then, but boy, was there a big spike back there toward the end of last year, and all of a sudden, food prices and egg prices were being discussed as a huge thing. Well, these prices were signaling things. They were signaling that it was difficult to ship things out of China when the Chinese ports were closed by COVID. It was difficult to get eggs when there were substantial waves of avian flu going on in the population. These things were signals. But overall, if you believed in averages, it seemed as if things were getting cheaper. This is the personal consumption expenditure index over the last period of like a decade and a half. Non-durable goods in general, durable goods way down. Why? Well, being made in many cases, more being made by robots or being imported from countries with low labor costs. The price of a refrigerator, when you could get it, was dropping. But there's a curve I did not include here. It looked as if things were getting cheaper. But that orange curve that I just allowed to come back in was services. Paying people to do stuff, that kept going up to the extent that you were dependent on people, and these did not necessarily mean doctors and lawyers. This also meant plumbers and auto mechanics and dental hygienists. The costs of services were in fact rising. And if you unpack averages, among the most dangerous things in the world is people who think they understand something because they understand the average. If you unpack the average and look at the exceptions, it turns out that the things that were going up a lot more than the average were hospital services, college tuition, food and beverage and housing. So were things getting cheaper? well, yeah, if you were okay with being unhealthy, unskilled, hungry, and homeless. In that case, you were living in a cheaper world. But if you actually cared about being healthy and having the skills to have a fulfilling job and putting healthy food on your table and having a place to live, the picture became very different very quickly. This is one of the things that I pounce upon whenever someone thinks they know what's happening because they're tracking the behavior of an average. If you flip a coin, the average result is that it lands on edge. This hardly ever happens. It almost always lands heads or tails. I'm not sure I've ever seen someone flip a coin and have it land on edge, even though that's the average result. And many of the distributions of things that are happening today are not nice bell curves with a big pump in the middle, where the average is also the most likely value. They are double hump distributions where there's a very likely outcome that's high and a very likely outcome that's low. And when we're talking about what's happening with AI and the effect that it's having on the job market, is it going to increase overall productivity? Watch this space. We're going to get to that in one of the later acts of the talk today. And the notion that you're going to be okay as long as you become a technical person, as long as you get the skills, as long as you upskill, reskill, you're going to be okay. I worry about it. I worry about saying, well, that's okay. If you learn to code, you'll be fine. Coding, it seems to me, is kind of like driving. There are people who make a very nice living driving a truck. Driving a long-haul truck, $90,000 a year. If you're an owner-operator, you'll be able to do fine. And I think that that's kind of the heart of what we've thought of as being the professional coder market. You got some significant skills. You don't just have the level of skills that would allow you to write a couple of lines of macro code in an Excel spreadsheet. You got some pretty serious stuff. The long-haul truck drivers, of course, are among the people who are most in the process of some of the autonomous driving technologies that are coming along. So, caveat on that. Now, what people hope they'll be is the coding equivalent of a Formula One driver who makes $30 million a year. They imagine themselves being the next Bill Gates, the next Mark Zuckerberg, the next whatever. Of course, these people have come and gone as far as reputations go. Mark Zuckerberg, believe it or not, was on the cover of Time magazine one year as Person of the Year, while back when it was still fashionable to like Mark Zuckerberg. Now it is so. But there's the $90,000 a year truck driver, the $30 million a year F1 driver, and then there's the $34,000 a year Uber driver. And as being able to program or being able to use low-code and no-code tools become more common, this is my concern, is that people will be going and getting expensive skills and acquiring certifications and things, and then finding out that that's really not the skill that's going to matter. Being able to think in code. This is tremendously important. Being able to look at a problem and to see patterns, like this is an iteration, this is a data structure that I need to devise. Being able to look at the world and see it through the lens of someone who can write code when necessary, tremendously important. So learning to code, absolutely an important thing to do. But planning to have a career as a coder, I think is probably not a good plan for more than the next few years at most. And the current thinking within Salesforce is that the future of application development, and we'll talk about this more a little on, is that instead of taking a flow chart of an existing process and turning that into a programming language, you're going to look at people getting a job done, look at the questions they ask, and build tools that can answer the questions. If that sounds like generative AI, well, yeah. People want to be able to do this. The cost of coding something and having the thing that you coded solve yesterday's problem, instead of being able to adapt on the fly and solve new problems and answer new questions, that cost of that rigidity is a cost that's going up. The value of things that can be resilient and adaptive is also clearly going up. Which brings us to Act 2. Talent, technology, and process. At this point, feel free to imagine Bach and Turner Overdrive singing Taking Care of Business, if you remember this one, but maybe I date myself by remembering this song. It has been quite some time since I first started using the slide you're about to see, where a friend of mine was taking a college-level statistics class, in which a homework problem was, what are the odds of dealing a full house? And they were working on this and trying to make sure they got this right. It's not a permutations problem, it's a combinations problem. It's combinations of certain things taken a certain number at a time. It's not trivial to set it up. It's a pretty decent college problem set. But I thought, okay, I'm going to go over to Wolfram Alpha, which is the free natural language inquiry interface online to the computational engine that's in a much more expensive piece of software called Mathematica. And I just asked them, what are the odds of dealing with a full house? This was years ago. We were not talking about generative AI. OpenAI did not exist as a company. I literally forget how long ago this was, but it's probably been 6 or 7 years at least. And I just asked them the context-free question, what are the odds of dealing with a full house? That's about as minimal a prompt as you can imagine. We weren't calling them prompts back then either, but. And it correctly inferred that I was probably talking about poker. It suspected that 5-card might be a good default assumption, so it began by offering me a 5-card answer. It recapitulated what it believed I was asking. Oh, okay, are you asking about the chance of dealing 3 matching cards of one rank and 2 matching cards of another rank? Showed me an example, gave me the decimal approximation, the exact integer ratio, and showed its work. And while it was at it, said, by the way, here are the hands of lesser value and the hands of greater value. And that was years ago. This is a college level skill. You would pay tuition dollars to take a statistics and probability class at this level. I did a few years back. And now it's a free website. Okay, being able to set up the problem, being able to understand how to play poker is not the same thing as just being able to know the odds. Although this is one of those things where people who can do this in their heads are still somewhat valuable. I'm not sure how much longer that's valuable, but this is a quantitative skill. Yeah, we know computers do that. We know that computers are going to take over costs and skills of calculation. We know that it's okay now to teach kids to take a math class with a calculator, and we don't really have arguments anymore about should there be calculators in the room during the math quiz. It'd be stupid not. But now we get some other stuff. Someone talked earlier about you don't hand the Terminator a scalpel and have it do brain surgery. And so when I was thinking about this talk, I thought, what would happen if I asked Stable Diffusion to give me a picture of the Terminator doing brain surgery? Okay, interesting. They got the Terminator about right, but it's doing brain surgery on itself, it seemed. It didn't really understand the context of the phrase doing brain surgery. So what did I do? I did what we do today. I said, oh, okay, I need to clarify my prompt a little bit. Let's make that performing brain surgery. And now you can see it's holding surgical tools. But I'm not really getting the context here. If I look at this, it doesn't immediately suggest the Terminator is in an operating room, doing medical stuff. So I clarified the prompt a little further. Given the Terminator cyborg performing brain surgery in an operating room. Well, this is really interesting because I didn't tell it that a robot doing surgery would have the surgical tools integrated into its hand. It wouldn't have to pick up a surgical tool and hold it. Its hands, fingers would be the tools. This was a novel concept that the system generated completely without any help from me. It shows a room that looks like an operating room. But at this point, it doesn't really have that Terminator vibe. It doesn't give me that leather jacket. It doesn't really give me the feeling I really want. So I gave it one more. I said, okay, what is it that I want? I want something that's immediately recognizable as the Terminator, as people anticipate seeing it. Doing surgery, so it's going to be having a mask, it's going to be holding a scalpel, it's going to be something that you can relate to a human being, only it's been replaced by the robot. So the new prompt I gave was the Terminator cyborg holding a scalpel and wearing a surgical mask in an operating room. And I got the image that you've already seen today, because that was generated by Stable Diffusion. This is the first time that I've used a Gen AI image generator to illustrate a talk. And I suspect I'm going to be doing it more from now on, because with a few minutes of iterative clarification of my prompt, I really was able to get an image that I'm not sure I could have found the way I usually do this kind of thing with Google image search. And it is something that I know is free of any copyright concerns because the Patent and Copyright Office has ruled that algorithm-generated stuff is not eligible for copyright, that a human author must be involved for there to be a copyright. This is already a matter of policy. Interesting. And what it shows is that the ability to draw that picture is now somewhat less valuable than it was compared to the ability to iterate over the space and ask the right question to get the picture I want. Have we squeezed the balloon to where the ability to answer questions has become relatively cheap? The price of the answer has become very small compared to what I have to pay someone to ask the right question. And this reminded me of a book that I actually referred to last year, but I'm going to be talking about it in a completely different context now, which is John Brunner's novel Stand on Zanzibar, in which the world's number one or number two AI is being used by a major corporation to do essentially the comprehensive development plan for an African country, which is rich in natural resources, but has been very poor in other things over the years. And they have a massive development plan, infrastructure, education, all of this stuff. And when they take it from simulation mode to production mode, it just says, well, don't be ridiculous. I'm not going to answer your question. And they're a little concerned about this. They're billions of dollars riding on the idea that this thing will run in the project for them. And it's just basically saying, no, not going to do it. And they bring someone in who starts asking questions. Starts with, what's wrong with the project? The AI says, won't work. Okay, would it be fair to say you don't believe what you've been told? No, I don't believe it. And there are a few more things go back and forth. There's some clarifying questions that I've taken out for purposes of brevity here. But this person then asked the question, postulate that all the data you've been given are true. What else would it take to reconcile all of that with everything else you know? And in the novel at this point, jaws drop around the room because no one ever thought of this approach. They just kept on trying to bang on the computer and tell it stuff until it would give it what they wanted. Asking the machine, what's the missing keystone of the arch here? What would you have to be told for everything else to make sense? Unbelievably obvious once someone does it. Completely didn't occur to any of them. I don't think it would have occurred to me before I was 12 years old reading this book. And the machine comes back and says, a force of unknown nature is acting on the population. This is a country, by the way, where they have very low homicide rates, very, very low, the things that come with being a poor, underdeveloped country just aren't present. And that's why the machine was going nuts, was saying, how come these people act like they're so happy? And it turned out that there was a reason. It was a biological cause. They basically had a pheromone that made them all very happy. But the machine came back and said, well, a force of unknown nature is acting on the population and making them behave oddly. So he says, okay, it exists and we're trying to figure out what it is. And then he says, all right, now try it. And says, oh, okay, the return on the project is going to be X. And they say, yeah, I think he's done it. 1968. Brunner did a pretty remarkable thing there. He anticipated a completely different model of how we would interact with machine intelligence. Not by simply telling it stuff and asking it to tell us what that means, but even asking it, what's the missing thing here that would explain this? And this is how we use AI within Salesforce. We have quarterly forecast is being discussed, and someone looks at the number and looks at the model and says, okay, your number is different from the model. What do you know that the model's not capturing? What's your intuition here that we failed to capture? We don't use the AI to overrule the person, but we use it to hold up a mirror to the person and say, the AI sees this, you see that. Let's clarify the differences. It's a fantastic focusing tool. It doesn't do a mediocre job of replacing a person. It does a great job of what a Photoshop filter would call sharpening the edges and finding out what the person knows that the system wasn't doing right. This is how you do this. And this is how you guys, I hope, will approach the increased use and availability of generative AI in your workplaces is that it's a tool for sharpening your focus on the things that weren't obvious and on the things that only a person understood, and finding ways to crank those in. Because what we're going to be doing now is not so much writing algorithms. We're going to be world building. This is a formalism from the rule-based language clips that I was using in 1987, where instead of writing the procedure, you just assert the facts and assert the available options and throw it into an inference engine and let it generate a procedure. This is a classic problem in AI called the monkeys and bananas. Monkey comes into the room. There are bananas hanging from the middle of the ceiling. There's a couch over there that it's too heavy to move. There's a box over there that is not too heavy to move. You assert the facts. You assert the possibilities. Then you step back and watch. And without you ever writing procedural code, the monkey goes to the box, moves it into the bananas, gets the bananas. It's fascinating to watch this happen. The underlying engine takes the world you've described, evaluates the paths through that world, the states that it could change, and gives you the path that produces the result. And it's a completely different way of thinking about what the job of a computer professional is. You're no longer telling it procedurally what to do. Your job now is to be an investigator and a representer of the world of fact and possibility and goal and intention, and then use this ridiculous 100 billion-fold abundance of computing power to generate the pathway through all of that. It's a wonderful way to think about what we do here. And what it suggests is the question, well, what are the skills that will inform world building as opposed to algorithm coding? What will a website never replace? And some of you have seen this list from me before. The Institute for the Future has phrases like transdisciplinarity. We need people who have not narrowly specialized in one field, but can bring an insight from biology with an insight from impressionist art. If you can be that kind of person, great. If you can be the kind of person who can bring groups like that together and get them to complement each other, okay, that's good too. What is computational thinking? Oddly, just a few months ago, I had a conversation with Stephen Wolfram, as in Wolfram Alpha, as in Mathematica, in which he says the real important thing right now is to get people doing computational thinking, to understand what an algorithm can and cannot do, what a data structure needs to be able to approach things with that mechanism in mind, and then figure out what new information you're going to need to make that work. And again, this is something that low code and no code tools invite us to do. Because now instead of where does that semicolon go? Now I can actually be saying, okay, yeah, but what have you not factored in here? What is the distorting factor? I once saw someone do an analysis for a college statistics class, oddly enough, of the behavior of the stock market, in which they made their presentation. And it turned out that in describing rates of return of different stocks against different considerations and measures of corporate performance, they had completely left out the fact that some stocks pay dividends and some paying no dividends. Some stocks are paying you 8 or 10% a year in dividends, and some are paying 0. And this had been completely left out of their analysis, which, as far as I'm concerned, made the analysis essentially garbage. It was a meaningless exercise in calculation to do all the work they'd done while completely ignoring a huge component of financial return. That's the kind of thing that we are now less likely to do because we have more time, more brain width available to be looking around the edges of the problem and say, what have we left out here? McKinsey calls this doing a pre-mortem. If it turns out we've really screwed up here, how will we most likely have screwed up? It's an interesting kind of question to ask. And well, we might have left out a component of the value. Like what? I don't know. Let's think about what that could be. Now we have the luxury of time to think about what we might have forgotten instead of being so overwhelmed with the things we know and the semicolons we have to position. that we just have to get something working. Then there's what Steve Jobs used to call sense making. Again, he was brilliant at this. He would look at something like an MP3 player and say, why does this have all these buttons and knobs to do things people don't really care about, but it doesn't have music in it, and it has no easy way of getting it? And that was how iPod became iPod plus iTunes, and why the word podcast showed up in the Oxford English Dictionary 3 years later. He literally redefined the act of downloading stuff from the internet to listen to it by visualizing the overall experience of giving people their favorite songs in their pocket instead of visualizing the physical product of an MP3 player. And that's what sense making means, is being able to zoom out, not be overwhelmed by the details. Say, yeah, but what's the need that's being met here? And what are the pieces of that we're completely ignoring because we're so focused on the parts that are currently taking up all of our attention? And a lot of this is social intelligence. If you want to build a transdisciplinary group of people who use different vocabularies, different specialized, lexicons and argos, if you want to bring these people together and have them see each other as contributing different kinds of value, I call this the Dreamforce lunch conversation, where people are sitting on the lawn outside the Yerba Buena Center, and you've got someone from casino gambling, someone from automobile manufacturing, someone from government, someone from healthcare, who've only just met because they happen to have gotten their sandwiches from the same cart and happen to sit down together. And they're discovering they're all playing the same Monopoly game with different names on the streets and different shapes of the pieces, but they're all playing the same games of, how do I engage my served community? How do I attract and retain and deploy the talent that's increasingly difficult to find, increasingly expensive? The price of talent is going up, and we need to treat that price as a signal that we need to find better ways of bringing more people into the pool. These are important measures. How do I find this stuff? I do applicant interviews for my alma mater, and I am always very happy to run into a student who's done FIRST Robotics, because I don't care if they want to do robotics for a career. I care that they've been involved in an activity that requires them to think about money, hardware, software, competitive strategy. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had with FIRST Robotics participants have been the people whose job is the analytics of watching the other team's robots function or fail, and coming back to their group and saying, okay, it looks like these are the areas where we're going to have the biggest opportunity to outperform the competition, or the biggest risks if we don't work on this. Who knew that sports analytics were becoming a major component of FIRST Robotics competitions? I didn't know that until last year, when this suddenly started to show up on my radar in my applicant interviews. And in the other side, the Air Force is doing these Cyber Patriot competitions, which are eliciting the future of cybersecurity talent. And within companies, for people in middle and even late career stages, hackathons. We're finding fantastic results when companies, including many of our big Salesforce customers, come together and people show each other what they've built. People who are accidental admins, people who are citizen developers, people who do not have jobs with titles like programmer analyst or even business analyst. We're just getting their work done. And instead of coming up with ways to do it in a spreadsheet, they've, maybe with the aid of things like Trailhead, discovered the pathways for doing these things with the platform. It's fantastic stuff. Don't minimize the other aspects of things that's useful to know. My good friend Dave Aiken, who wrote the Aiken's Laws of Spacecraft Design back when he was a grad student at MIT, there's a long list. But his number one rule, engineering is done with numbers, but you get all the way down to rule 30, learn to draw. If you want to have maximum effect on a system, realize that it's probably going to wind up being built by the engineers who were heavily influenced by the best artist's conception of what the thing might be. Learn to draw. And figuratively speaking, learn to draw. Learn to show people a picture, mental or literal, of the thing you're imagining the outcome to be, if you want to influence what they'll all agree they're trying to build. Learn to draw. Learn to use graphical analytics like Tableau. Learn to come up with ways of doing data presentation. Go read Edward Tufte. on visual display of quantitative information. Learn to show people a picture rather than just, trying to give them words. Which brings us to Act 3. Big picture. Earth, Wind, and Fire. At this point, feel free to imagine Journey singing Don't Stop Believing. Because if I sound like I'm being a little negative here today, that's not my goal. My goal is to direct the positivity, not to suppress it. Climate is no longer something that might be a thing someday. It's just not. Not when State Farm says they're going to stop writing new homeowners insurance policies in the entire state of California because the state is becoming too uninsurable with largely climate-related threats. That's whoa, really? Entire sections of the Midwest that are now subject to these so-called derecho events that can take out entire fields of crops. And in fact, 90% of Georgia's anticipated peach crop for this year was essentially destroyed by a whipsaw effect of some early warming that caused the trees to start developing in a certain way, followed by a cold snap. These volatilities, these unexpected surges of climate are altering what you can buy in your stores. This is no longer a hypothetical. Interestingly, this is something that was being discussed 2 years ago about whether a warming South would stop being the place that would allow Georgia to be, Atlanta to be the peach tree city. These are things that we can see coming at us. We have to open our eyes and let the prices signal what's changing. Because talking about climate change is no longer talking about save the whales or even save the planet. It's about save my lifestyle, save my ability to live where I want to live and have the kind of life I want to have. The challenge is that these are problems in which solving one problem creates a problem for somebody else. Some of you have seen me use this slide before. The so-called wicked problems, where a solution that's good for one thing is bad for another, and we need models. I'm going to elaborate because this is an example I was not using before. Let's talk about repercussions of the systems. Electric cars, great, cleaner air. But if you live in Hungary, where they're building a super battery factory, to you, electric cars are just another manufactured product. Those super battery factories have some pretty significant environmental issues. If you live in the deserts of Chile, where the lithium is being dug up to make these batteries, you see electric car adoption as groundwater depletion and air pollution because they lay out these brine ponds and evaporate it and extract the lithium from what's left behind. And in the meantime, the dust in the air is seriously toxic. And meanwhile, China has locked up the access to a lot of the world's easily available lithium reserves as determined by prices. If the price of lithium went up, there's a whole lot of lithium in the Western US that we could afford to extract. Right now, it's not considered reserves. Why? Because the price is being artificially pushed down by China. Why? Because there are geopolitical advantages to being the world's leading producer of electric vehicles and batteries. All of these signals tangle up with each other. You need to unpack them. And to do that, you need better models of what's actually going on, functional and predictive models, and willingness to do it. And this was just a few days ago, saw this article about the policymakers from the various financial central banks and so on, saying, we got to look at the price pressures. They actually use the phrase price pressures because Christine Lagarde, who's a very smart lady, who's currently running the European Central Bank, said, there's no playbook for what we're in today. And a member of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors said, no, you don't need a new playbook. You need new models. You're still going to be calling the plays, but you need a model that tells you when. You can't have a model of when to throw the ball versus running the ball in football that ignores the question of whether the field is muddy that day. You need better models that include things like the mud on the field before you decide which play to call. And this is kind of going back to what I said before. It's not about dictating the process that's the challenge. It's the world building that helps you understand what the process is going to be. I talked earlier about, for example, the notion of productivity. Well, does a supermarket self-checkout kiosk make people more productive? It shifts labor from someone who used to have a job of being a checkout clerk to someone who is just there to do the shopping. It's a labor shifting tool. It's not really a labor reduction tool. I mean, you can kind of imagine a checkout clerk just sitting there scanning the stuff instead of having to punch in the prices. increasingly you don't find a lot of that except when you're like buying alcohol or something and they want a human being to confirm you're legal. But now pretty much they'll probably just let you scan your driver's license to do that. But notice, since 1980, men without a high school degree, real wages, inflation adjusted, down 9%. Women, 2.3%. Why? Because women dominated low-paid occupations to begin with. Remember what I said before about averages. You might think, oh, average productivity is going up. Yeah, but if you're in that relatively unskilled piece of the population, you're not going up. And this is changing the world. Eric Brynjolfsson and Andy McAfee called it the emergence of the U-shaped curve. It used to be more skills you had, the more money you could make. Very straightforward linear relationship. And now your dental hygienist and your plumber are doing fine, and your particle physicist and your stockbroker are probably doing fine. But the people in the middle and the so-called gray collar and pink collar jobs, they're the ones who are really asking, am I going to have a job here? Someone asked me the other day, are there going to be fewer customer service agents when we have generative AI? My answer was, if you think of them as customer service agents, there will be fewer. If you think of them as the producers of every individual customer's personal Truman Show, there will be more of them, because what they will be doing now is being lifestyle advisors rather than people who read the manual to you. They will not be people who follow a script. Generative AI can follow scripts, but people can say, so tell me more about where you were when you were trying to, take this kind of picture with your camera. Oh, wow. There are lenses that are not the standard lens of the camera that you might find much more suitable for landscape photography. The opportunity, and this has already happened in things like bank tellers. Should bank tellers have been replaced long since by ATMs? Yes. Are there more bank tellers today than there were before ATMs? Yes. Because today a bank teller is looking at your account profile and say, you are actually eligible for our private client banking services if you maintain a higher balance. Would you be interested in that? And having those conversations is value creating. That U-shaped curve is not figurative. Someone did an actual analysis of demand for jobs based on a formal assessment of skill level. And wow, demand for the so-called medium skilled job is down. And it's an inequality dimension. Women are more at risk. People of color are more at risk. The distribution of people across jobs, cross product with the relevance of AI to taking over the functions of those jobs. This makes this an equality conversation. It's great to be at Salesforce where we get to talk about equality as one of our 5 core values instead of just being something over there on the other side. Being able to say there is an equality impact here gets the attention of people within the Salesforce corporate walls and I think in the larger community, because we realize if we're not going to take an active role in addressing this proactively and mitigating it when we see it happening, well, who will? This goes back to 8 years ago when the TV series Humans projected a future in which synthetic androids become a household accessory. And a young woman is having a pre-college teenager is having a conversation with her parents where they're talking about, her great future. And she's saying, yeah, the world's my oyster. If it's 7 years of training, I can be a doctor. When a synth could be doing heart surgery after a 5-minute upgrade. In 2015, that might have been considered a somewhat futuristic conversation. Today, I'm not sure there aren't dinner table conversations happening right now where parents are talking to each other or maybe talking with a college-bound offspring about what are the majors you're going to choose, what are the fields of study in which there's still going to be a real career, especially because you're going to be competing with people in the workplace who might not have been there before. The number of 75-year-olds who aren't just going to retire, but are still going to be working, the experienced folks are not going to be gracefully getting out of the way they used to. They need to work longer, and they want to work longer. They're healthier. The whole picture of the job market you're entering is going to be different. And the reason Code 2040 is named Code 2040 is that's the year when white people stop being the majority, another factor. It helps if we unpack the barriers in terms of fragmentation, technical fragmentation, the conditions of, like the internet being chopped up into separate internets by country, which is an increasing thing. Governmental fragmentation, the role of government policy, what happens when a government says, oh, this is anti-competitive, we're not going to let you do this. It alters the ability to adopt new technologies. and commercial fragmentation when you have turf wars being fought, for example, between the people with vested interest in continuing to produce gasoline-powered cars versus people who would really like to sell you electric vehicles. There's a lot of infrastructure issues involved here. My son, who's a project manager at Luskin School of Innovation at UCLA, was involved in a major report on the secondary and tertiary impacts of adopting electric vehicles. There's whole ecosystems built around the gasoline-powered car that are going to be disrupted or maybe even eliminated. And your personal choices matter. The clothing we buy, the microplastics that those fabrics shed in the wash, those are an unpriced externality. The amount of the world's fresh water that's used to grow cotton, these things are probably not showing up in the price tag. There's a lot of cheap, fast fashion out there that has an enormous price being paid by people who don't get to wear the clothes. And awareness of this is just a personal choice, one that I highly recommend. But these are areas in which we need to find better ways to signal the costs if we want intelligent decisions to be made. And do not expect that the pace of change will level off. Anyone who draws an S-curve, rebut it vigorously. Just in the last 2 days, IBM has been showing architectures for some chips that can do what one of those literally $40,000 NVIDIA chips does. I was astonished to discover that price the other day, with 14 times better energy efficiency. The exponential improvement of technology is still happening. It's not too late to ride that curve. And in fact, people who think that, okay, now I understand the technology, I'll make my choices based on the present technology, they will be making a mistake. You need to be skating to where the puck is going to be. We do not want this. The first 20 minutes of the movie Elysium are probably the most powerful of the movie. The rest of it is just kind of an action flick. But the realistic portrayal of a world in which the best job you can get is one building robots, I think is kind of terrifying to people. And the question of, am I holding a wrench and pounding a nail with it because I don't understand how to use the tool? I think a lot of people right now are saying, is this my problem? Do I need to work harder to wrap my head around what these tools can do with me and for me instead of doing it to me? But the positive statement here, and this again is just from a few days ago, someone said, ChatGPT and its ilk do not nuke the jobs. They increase the demand for products in which now more information can be obtained from a single radiological image, for example. That last line, we're still looking to hire. There is so much negativity and angst around the question of, is my job threatened by AI, that I think people are just not seeing what's there to be seen, which is, with this power tool, I will be able to do stuff I could not do before. I am going to be surfing this wave and not overcome by this wave. It is so valuable to have groups like this event that bring people together who I believe are ready to do that, who have the tools to do that, and who have the inclination to do it. Thank you so much for the chance to be part of the event this year. It's always something I look forward to doing, because otherwise I would never know what I think. Thank you for your time.
Hey, thank you so much, Peter. And unfortunately, we do not have time for Q&A right now, but is there a good way for them to connect with you with any questions?
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I really wanted to give you 10 minutes at the end, and I was having too much fun.
Oh, no, we were having fun listening.
Yeah, well, I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm pcoffee@salesforce.com. I'm in the Trailblazer community. It's not hard to get my attention because the questions people ask are literally the meat of my research. The things people want to know tell me what we have to be getting better at doing. So please do not feel that it would be an imposition to reach out to me. LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that, other than any of the specific Salesforce channels. But I don't object to getting emails at pcoffee@salesforce.com. And if this kind of thing would ever be helpful for me to share with a group of you and your coworkers outside of a Dreamin type event or at a partner or customer event, it's never an offense to be invited to come talk, because it's only by looking inside my head that I find out what I think. So thank you again for your time.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. And you heard him. Please send him questions so he has things to talk about next year at Mile High Dreamin 24. Thank you so much again.